Imagine standing on a battlefield in the Pacific, 1942. The Japanese Imperial Army has cracked every code the United States military has thrown at them. Every cipher, every encryption, every carefully constructed system, designed by the brightest minds in American intelligence, cracked. And then, from the jungles of Guadalcanal, something comes over the radio that stops Japanese cryptographers cold. They listen, they replay it. They run it through every known decryption method available to one of the most advanced military powers on Earth. Nothing, not a single word deciphered, not a single message broken. And here's the part that will stay with you. The code they were trying to crack was not a code at all. It was a language, a living, breathing language that had existed on this continent for centuries before anyone in Tokyo or Washington had ever picked up a radio. Welcome to Frontier Uncensored. I'm your host, Dustin, and today we're diving into one of the most overlooked and misunderstood stories in all of American history. 25 facts about Native American cultures that will completely shatter everything you thought you knew. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe and tap that bell. You do not want to miss what comes next, because by the end of this video, you'll be asking yourself how so much of this got left out of the history books. Let's start at the very beginning, not 1600, not 1492. We're going back 15,000 years. 15,000 years ago, as the last great ice age was releasing its grip on the northern hemisphere, a migration began. Groups of people crossed what geologists call the Bering Land Bridge, a now submerged corridor of land connecting modern-day Siberia to Alaska. They moved south. They spread east and west. Generation after generation, they pushed into a continent that had never known human footsteps. They were not wandering aimlessly. They were exploring deliberately, adapting rapidly, and building something extraordinary. By the time European ships appeared on the horizon, these peoples had been shaping North and South America for over 148 centuries. Think about that number. Over 500 generations of accumulated knowledge, culture, agriculture, architecture, astronomy, medicine, and governance. All of it developed independently. All of it representing one of the greatest human stories ever told. And yet somehow, the dominant narrative reduced all of it to a handful of stereotypes. That changes today. Let's talk about language, because this is where the scale of what was lost truly hits you. Before European colonization, North America alone was home to over 300 distinct languages, not dialects, not regional variations of the same tongue. 300 completely separate linguistic systems, each with its own grammar, its own vocabulary, its own way of encoding reality. Scholars estimate that the linguistic diversity of pre-contact North America rivaled that of the entire modern world. Today, due to forced assimilation programs, residential school systems, and deliberate cultural suppression, roughly 175 of those languages survive. Many of those that remain are spoken by only a handful of elders. Each time one of those elders passes without passing the language on, a library burns, an irreplaceable library. But here is the story of survival inside that tragedy. Navajo. With approximately 170,000 speakers, Navajo stands as the most widely spoken Native American language in the United States today. It survived, and as you already know from the opening of this video, that survival had consequences that reached all the way to the shores of the Pacific. Now, here is the question I want you to sit with. If the Japanese military could not break the Navajo language in the middle of the most sophisticated intelligence war ever fought, what does that tell you about the complexity of a linguistic system that academics once dismissed as primitive? Keep that question in the back of your mind. Let's talk about the land itself, because the relationship Native Americans had with the soil beneath their feet was nothing short of revolutionary. When Europeans arrived, they encountered what they described as wilderness, untouched, primordial, natural. What they were actually looking at was the result of thousands of years of deliberate, sophisticated land management. The forests of the eastern seaboard, the great meadows of the interior, the carefully maintained buffalo grasslands of the plains, these were not accidents of nature. They were gardens, the largest gardens in human history. Native American agricultural knowledge produced techniques that modern sustainable farming is only now beginning to fully understand. Crop rotation, controlled burning to maintain soil health and prevent catastrophic wildfires, irrigation networks in arid desert environments that supported large, permanent populations. And perhaps the most elegant agricultural innovation ever devised, the three sisters. Corn, beans, and squash, planted together in a relationship so perfectly engineered that it mirrors a modern scientific concept called companion planting. The corn stalks grow tall, providing a natural trellis for the climbing beans. The beans, through their root systems, pull nitrogen from the atmosphere and fix it directly into the soil, fertilizing the corn. The squash spreads low along the ground, its broad leaves shading the earth, locking in moisture and suppressing weeds. 3 plants, 3 functions, 0 waste, maximum yield. This was not discovered by accident. This was the product of generations of careful observation, experimentation, and refinement. This was applied science, practiced by cultures that supposedly had no concept of science. And that brings us to medicine, because what Native American healers understood about the natural pharmacy surrounding them is still being unlocked today. They were using willow bark tea, containing compounds now synthesized as aspirin to manage pain and reduce fever. They understood the antimicrobial properties of echinacea. They employed Jimson weed as an anesthetic during surgical procedures, centuries before European medicine had developed anything comparable. And this is not speculation. Modern pharmacological research has traced the origins of a significant number of contemporary medications directly to plants first identified and utilized by Native American healers. But here is what makes this more than just a list of medical firsts. Their approach to health was fundamentally different from the European model. They did not separate the physical from the spiritual. They did not treat a symptom in isolation from the whole person. Their healers understood, intuitively, something that modern psychoneuroimmunology is now confirming with clinical data, that the mind, the body, and the social environment are inseparably connected. Healing was not just about the plant, it was about the ceremony, the community, the restoration of balance. Now, let's talk about something that will genuinely reshape how you think about the history of democracy. Because here is a question most history textbooks never bother to ask. Where did the founding fathers get their ideas? The standard answer involves Locke, Montesquieu, ancient Athens, and the Roman Republic. And those influences were real. But there is a chapter of that story that gets quietly omitted. By the time Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson were discussing the architecture of a new republic, they had spent decades living in proximity to a functioning, sophisticated democratic system that had been operating on this continent for potentially 500 years. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, known also as the Iroquois Confederacy, was a political alliance of 6 nations: the Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, the Oneida, the Seneca, and later, the Tuscarora. Their governing document, the Great Law of Peace, established a Grand Council composed of elected chiefs, operating under a system of checks and balances, with mechanisms for impeachment, for deliberation, for consensus, and for the protection of individual rights. Benjamin Franklin was explicit about his admiration for this system. He cited it directly in correspondence. He proposed that the American colonies model their confederation on the Haudenosaunee model. And in 1988, the United States Congress formally acknowledged the influence of the Iroquois Confederacy on the Constitution of the United States. That acknowledgement is in the congressional record. It happened. And yet, somehow, it rarely makes it into the high school curriculum. At this point, I want to pause and ask you something directly. If you grew up in the American education system, how much of what we have covered so far did you learn in school? Be honest. Leave your answer in the comments, because I think the responses are going to be eye-opening. Now, let's get back to the sky, because this is where things get genuinely extraordinary. Long before the construction of modern observatories, before telescopes, before any of the instruments we associate with astronomy, Native American peoples were mapping the cosmos with a precision that continues to astonish researchers. They tracked the movements of the sun, the moon, the planets, and hundreds of individual stars. They identified patterns that allowed them to predict solstices and equinoxes with accuracy that rivals modern measurements. They built those predictions into the architecture of their cities. Look at Cahokia, located near present-day St. Louis, Illinois. Cahokia was at its peak one of the largest cities in the world, larger than London in the year 1100 CE. The central mound, Monk's Mound, covers more ground than the Great Pyramid at Giza. And surrounding the city, researchers have identified a series of large wooden posts, arranged in precise circles, that functioned as a solar calendar, an American Stonehenge, aligned to track the movement of the sun through the year. Look at Pueblo Bonito in New Mexico's Chaco Canyon. Its architecture is oriented to capture specific shafts of light at the winter solstice and the equinoxes. The building itself is the instrument. The building is the telescope. These were not coincidences. These were engineering achievements, built by cultures with a sophisticated mathematical understanding of celestial mechanics. And here is the open loop I want to plant for you right now, because we will come back to this. If Native American peoples had cities larger than medieval London, astronomical instruments built into their urban architecture, and trade networks spanning a continent, then why does the story we tell about this land always seem to begin with European arrival? What exactly are we choosing not to see? Let's talk about those trade networks, because the scale of them is staggering. Centuries before Columbus, a vast commercial web connected communities across the entire American continent. Copper mined in the Great Lakes region traveled south to communities in present-day Florida and Louisiana. Obsidian from volcanic sources in present-day Wyoming appeared in burial sites throughout the Midwest. Seashells from the Gulf of Mexico turned up in settlements on the Great Plains. Turquoise from the Southwest moved through networks that stretched into Central America. This was not casual barter between neighboring villages. This was organized, long-distance commerce, and it required infrastructure, roads, canoes, established routes, trusted intermediaries, weights, and standards, all of the foundational elements of a functioning economy. On the coast of California, the Chumash people were building plank canoes called tommels, sophisticated open-ocean vessels capable of carrying up to 20 people and traveling hundreds of miles. They were navigating by the stars, reading ocean currents, charting their course using celestial knowledge accumulated over generations. These were not primitive rafts. These were engineered watercraft, built by skilled craftsmen, operated by trained navigators. The image of the canoe-paddling Native American is not wrong. The context is everything that is missing. These were the merchant mariners of their world. Let's go back to the battlefield now, because we left a story unfinished. The Navajo Code Talkers. By the time the United States entered World War II, the military had a problem it could not solve through conventional means. Japanese cryptographers had proven devastatingly effective at intercepting and deciphering American communications. Something new was needed, something unprecedented. A civil engineer named Philip Johnston, who had grown up on the Navajo reservation as the son of a missionary and spoke the language fluently, approached the Marine Corps with a proposal. Use the Navajo language as the foundation for a spoken military code. The Marine Corps was skeptical. They recruited 29 Navajo men, now known as the original Code Talkers, and put the idea to a test. What those men created was extraordinary. They developed a system where Navajo words were assigned to military terminology. A turtle meant a tank, a bat meant an airplane, iron fish meant a submarine, and the underlying language itself, with its tonal complexity, its verb forms that encode spatial relationships, and states of being in ways that have no equivalent in European languages, was the encryption layer that no outside system could penetrate. At the Battle of Iwo Jima, Major Howard Connor, the signal officer of the 5th Marine Division, stated, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." The program was classified until 1968. For over 2 decades, these men could not tell anyone, not their families, not their communities, what they had done. They had helped turn the tide of the largest conflict in human history, and they came home to a country where, in many states, they were still not allowed to vote. The Congressional Gold Medal was eventually awarded. The movies were made. But the full weight of that contradiction, the service given and the rights withheld, is something worth sitting with. Now let's talk about something that almost never gets discussed when we talk about Native American history: gender. The rigid binary gender roles that European colonizers brought with them were not universal. They were cultural. And across many Native American societies, the structure of gender was considerably more nuanced, more flexible, and more equitable than anything contemporary European civilization was prepared to recognize. Many tribes operated under matrilineal inheritance systems, where clan identity and property passed through the mother's line. Women in these societies held significant political authority. Among the Haudenosaunee, Clan mothers held the power to select and remove the chiefs who sat on the Grand Council. Leadership was not simply male by default. It was earned, it was accountable, and it could be revoked. In many traditions, individuals who expressed what we might today describe as a non-binary gender identity were recognized as a distinct and honored category of person. The term two-spirit, adopted in more recent decades as an umbrella term by many indigenous communities, reflects a concept that existed in some form across hundreds of different tribal cultures. These individuals were often seen as having a unique spiritual gift, a perspective that bridged worlds, and they frequently served as healers, mediators, and ceremonial leaders. This is not a modern interpretation retroactively applied to the past. This is documented. This is in the oral histories, in the early anthropological records, and in the living traditions of communities that maintain these understandings through centuries of pressure to abandon them. We are roughly 2/3 through this journey, and I want to ask you something before we get to the final chapter. What surprised you most so far? The astronomy, the democracy, the medicine? Let me know in the comments, because this is the kind of conversation that actually matters. Let's talk about what it means for a culture to survive. By the early 20th century, the United States government had spent roughly 3 decades operating a system of boarding schools, specifically designed to eliminate Native American cultural identity. Children were forcibly removed from their families and communities. Their hair was cut. Their languages were forbidden. Their names were replaced with English names. The explicit policy, articulated openly by the architects of this system, was to destroy the culture in order to save the person. The damage inflicted by those institutions is not in the past. It is in the present. It is in the elevated rates of poverty, substance dependency, and mental health crisis that persist in reservation communities to this day. It is in the elders who carry memories they were never supposed to have survived, and in the younger generations who grew up disconnected from traditions their grandparents were punished for practicing. And yet, the culture survived. The languages are being taught again. Language nests, immersion programs, where young children spend their earliest years hearing nothing but their ancestral tongue, are operating in Navajo, in Cherokee, in Hawaiian, in dozens of other communities. Powwows that were once illegal gatherings are now vibrant celebrations attended by tens of thousands of people. Artists are working in traditional forms and contemporary media simultaneously, creating work that sits in galleries in New York and Paris alongside any other tradition in the world. The resilience here is not passive. It is not simply the survival of a remnant. It is active. It is intentional. It is a daily, generational decision to exist on one's own terms. There are today over 574 federally recognized tribal nations in the United States alone. Each one is a sovereign entity, not a historical artifact, not a relic, a living government with its own legal system, its own institutions, its own relationship with the federal government, established by treaty and by law. That sovereignty was not granted by the United States. It predates the United States. It was recognized, partially and imperfectly, through a series of treaties. Many of those treaties were broken almost as soon as they were signed. The legal and political struggle to enforce what remains of those agreements is ongoing, and it is one of the defining civil rights issues of our time. When water protectors gathered at Standing Rock in 2016, they were not protesting as environmentalists, though their cause was environmental. They were asserting treaty rights, rights established in the 1850s and guaranteed under federal law. The fact that those rights required a massive public protest to be taken seriously tells you something about the gap between legal recognition and actual respect. Now, let me bring this back to where we started. A battlefield in the Pacific, a code that could not be broken, a language that had survived 15,000 years of human history, 300 years of colonial pressure, decades of explicit government policy designed to erase it, and still emerged strong enough to serve as the most secure communication system available to the most powerful military force on Earth. Think about what that means. A language is not just a set of words. It is an entire way of perceiving reality, encoded in sound and syntax. When the Navajo language defeated Japanese cryptographers in 1942, it was not a military victory. It was a civilizational one. It was proof that something the most powerful institutions in the world had tried to destroy could not be destroyed, that it carried within it not just communication, but wisdom, complexity, and an architecture of thought that had no equivalent anywhere else on Earth. There is a concept in many Native American traditions of thinking 7 generations ahead, making decisions not based on what benefits the people alive today, but what will sustain the people who will live on this land 7 generations from now, roughly 140 years. At a moment when our civilization is struggling to think 4 years ahead, that principle feels less like ancient wisdom and more like urgent instruction. The history of Native American peoples is not a completed chapter. It is not a tragedy with a fixed ending. It is a living story told by over 5 million people in the United States alone, whose cultures have demonstrated a capacity for adaptation, endurance, and creative renewal that challenges every assumption about what civilization requires to survive. The question the history books never quite get around to asking is not what happened to Native America. The question is what we can learn from it. And I think that if you sat with everything we covered today, genuinely sat with it, you would agree that the answer to that question is quite a lot, more than any single video can cover. If you want to go deeper, leave a comment telling me which part of this story you want us to explore next. The full story of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the lost cities of the Mississippi Valley, the Navajo code talkers in their own words, the living language revival movements happening right now. There is enough material here for 100 episodes. If this video gave you something to think about, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit subscribe, because we do this every week, and we are just getting started. I'm Dustin. This is Frontier Uncensored.